Hello, my name is Jenny Fischer, and I'm a second language acquisition specialist at the National Foreign Language Center. And I selected a large number of authentic content for the NFLC's language learning app Lectica. In fact, everything we do at the NFLC is based on authentic content. So today I'm going to talk about how to select authentic content for language learning with focus on beginners. But first, what is authentic content? Let's take a look at the following video I selected for Portuguese.
Então vamos lá, gente. Olha só o que eu trouxe do mercado. Um chocotone, um pacote de farinha de trigo, um fardo de açúcar, um sazon sabor alho, 2 pacotes de arroz solito, 4 quilos de feijão, aqui macarrão pena e macarrão gravata.
So even if you do not speak Portuguese, you probably were able to guess the topic and even some of the vocabulary used in the video. It is basically a vlogger or YouTuber showing her weekly grocery haul. Let's see what the video's transcript and translation look like. As you can see, the transcript and translation contain more individual, loose words rather than complex sentence structures. In general, authentic content is a written or spoken text, as shown in the example, a video that was originally not produced or edited for language teaching and learning. Instead, authentic content describes a text made for speakers or native speakers in the target language culture. In our example, a random vlogger or influencer in Brazil on YouTube. Those types of texts often contain culturally specific information. In our case, the word chocotone. Chocotone is chocolate panettone cake that is typically enjoyed during Christmas time in Brazil. Or the word sazon. Sazon is a seasoning brand, the name of the brand that is sold in Brazil as well. Authentic materials also contain vocabulary used in daily life, including jargon, expressions, and phrases that are often excluded from commercial textbooks. Here, the expression, então vamos lá, gente, let's go everyone, is a high frequently used expression in Brazil that is not necessarily part of textbooks for Portuguese beginners. So by using a video like that, learners will become exposed to authentic language use and cultural input from the early beginning on. In order to find suitable content for the classroom, some criteria have to be taken into consideration. So how to find content? In the context of language learning and teaching, it is particularly important to look at how, when, where, by whom, and for whom authentic texts were produced. Let's take a look at the source from our video about a weekly grocery haul. To answer the question, how? The text seems to be a homemade personal video. When, you can see here, it was produced last year on October 25th, so it is very current and not outdated. For whom? In the video description, which is entirely in Portuguese, the video producer addresses her followers, advertising her channel, so it is made for speakers of Portuguese and not for learners. By whom? We can click on her name. It is a Portuguese name, and the location seems to be in Brazil, so it seems to be very authentic. Aside from looking at the source, it is important to keep your learning goals in mind and see how the authentic text suits these goals and your overall lesson plan. As mentioned before, an authentically produced text intends to convey a message to the speakers of the target language culture, something that didacticized texts, especially at the beginner's level, usually don't have, because their purpose is to focus on grammatical simplicity and the vocabulary recently introduced in the classroom. However, selecting authentic content does not mean that a certain grammatical and semantic simplicity should be entirely ignored. So in short, when selecting content, there are two main approaches to authenticity that should be considered. First, the target culture-oriented authenticity, and second, the learning context-related authenticity. The target culture-oriented authenticity primarily focuses on text produced for the target language speakers. For the beginner levels, content can contain timetables, receipts, weather reports, shopping lists, an announcement on a bus, a restaurant menu, recipes, etc. Learning context-related authenticity means that the lesson's current grammatical topics, or topics in general, and learners' experience with the topic are taken into consideration. So it is important to find a balance between using authentic content that informs about the target language culture, but gives learners a voice at the same time. Let's take a look at the following authentic reading text for language beginners of Portuguese. It is a recipe for pão de queijo, the typical Brazilian cheese bread, so it contains culturally specific information. The recipe was written by and primarily for Brazilian people and published on a recipe website that is well known in Brazil. However, most learners are familiar with the text genre recipe and might have experience using one. That means learners won't be completely overwhelmed also by the structures, as they are usually similar in most cultures. As shown here, the text contains instructions formatted as a numbered list using simple grammatical structures. Here, imperative, the command form, that is usually taught at the beginner level. Here's an example from the NFLC's language learning app Lectica of how that recipe as one example for an authentic text can be used to practice or even introduce grammatical structures relying on learners' pre-existing knowledge. Learners are asked to specifically focus on the verbs and what pattern they notice. So authentic text can be a great way for implicit grammar instruction. Moreover, in the classroom, it can be beneficial for the learner's success to embed these texts in authentic communicational context and the target culture's thematic context. For example, the lesson's topic is food. This recipe can serve to have learners prepare a shopping list, which they then use in a role play at the market between a merchant and a customer. So let's summarize the most important criteria for how to select authentic content once you found some. First, authentic content should be selected primarily with the learners in mind. Learners should be able to use their pre-existing knowledge and not become overwhelmed but rather motivated to continue learning. That can be done if the learners can find themselves in the content somehow. The type of learner-oriented content selection means they could potentially identify with the represented persons or positions in the text. Second, authentic content should be an adequate representation of the target language culture and do not foster pre-existing stereotypes. However, it all depends on how you actually work with the text in the classroom. Stereotypical text can certainly stimulate exciting discussions, although this is more likely in advanced groups. Third, it is important to select authentic content, not only for the mere reason that they are authentic. Instead, it is important to examine what the authentic content can offer the learner and to what extent the content could effectively contribute to positive learning success. A text used in a class must either contain meaningful text-based tasks that already prescribe a specific action for the learners, for example, the recipe we looked at, or should lead to meaningful text external tasks, as previously described in the context of making a shopping list and then going to the market and having a conversation with the merchant. Fourth, for beginners lessons, short texts are most suitable. Short texts do not pose any major challenges for learners since they are literally short, but also linguistically short and simply structured. Short texts fulfill a purpose and pursue a specific communication intention. As a result, they're usually self-contained, which is a good prerequisite for successful work with them in the classroom. When selecting authentic content specifically for beginners, it can be helpful to imagine the following scenario. You finished a crash course in the target language and you move to the country where the language is spoken. What day-to-day conversations do you expect to encounter? What written text might you come across and need to understand? What would you find most interesting as a newbie in the country? And what are the cultural differences between the target language culture and your native culture? It is essential to try empathizing with the learners and anticipate their understanding processes. You should carefully analyze which elements on which level, syntactic, semantic, pragmatic, etc., could raise potential difficulties, and how useful it is to work with the text because of these difficulties. The next step is phrasing concrete teaching and learning goals. As an instructor, what do I want to achieve with this text, and will I be able to accomplish this with the text? So after finding a potential suitable text, you as the language instructor should reflect on your own reading and comprehension process, asking yourself the following questions. How did I understand the text, and why did I understand it a certain way? Would a foreign language learner understand the text the same way I did, and which sections or structures could cause them problems? Where would I have to give additional information apart from the text so that it would be understood? And to what extent is my own understanding of the text subjective or cultural? These questions can also help you when scaffolding unknown vocabulary in preparatory activities. So let's go back to our scenario. You're new in a country, only know a few words of the target language, and have some basic knowledge about the culture. Keeping this scenario in mind will help you know where to look for content and what topics to choose from. So let's look at some examples for authentic content topics for beginners. But one thing in advance, almost anything written or spoken you encounter in your daily life can be considered an authentic source. The question is, how does it suit your learners? Remember, learner-oriented content selection. And how does it fit your overall lesson? Also, what are typical topics for beginner-level language learners? And how could you supplement these topics, often prescribed by the textbooks most instructors use, and that contain, as previously mentioned, didacticized purpose-written materials? So let's look at some of the typical beginner-level topics and gather some ideas for supplement texts. So one of the first topics learners usually come across is talking about themselves, introducing themselves, talking about where they're from, etc. So in order to supplement that, you could choose a talk show or an interview at the very first beginning when the host interviews his or her guests. Another typical topic is, as we talked about before, shopping or food. So you could select a video by a random YouTuber or influencer buying something at the market or in a grocery store, or just showing their weekly grocery haul. Another common topic is family. So you could use an ad, a personal ad from a dating platform, or a wedding invitation, a birthday card, where it's usually the vocabulary used from the topic of family. Leisure activities and food is another typical topic at the beginner level. So as mentioned before, you could use a cooking recipe, a restaurant menu, or an ad for a local festival or event. Another topic beginners usually come across are the seasons, weather, and time. So you could use an authentic weather report, could be an audio or video, or a reading text even. They exist in all modalities. Also a restaurant menu, as said before, a video of a park, an ad for a local festival, an introduction of a popular sport that is typical for the target culture, etc. Daily routine, so your morning routine, the daily routine, what people usually do is another topic. So you could just show these random YouTubers and influencers. They show their morning routines on social media. You could just use their videos in the target language culture. Or even workout instructions you can also find on social media that are also good to use when introducing body parts. Now, other topics include getting around the city or travel. So you could use warning and road signs, museum, movie, theater, opera schedule, or opening hours, or just local guides on YouTube showing around in their city, which is often combined with giving directions. Google Maps is also great to use when introducing directions in the target language. So in order to find the most culturally valuable content for the target language you teach, it can be helpful to consider some tips and tricks. First, set any search engine to the language you need content for, and type in keywords in the engine in that language as well. Despite Google, social media platforms such as Instagram and YouTube are useful for beginner level content. Often you will find influencers posting content from their daily life that contains adequate vocabulary for beginners. Depending on the language you teach, the mass of sources available for you can be overwhelming. So it is helpful to think about culturally relevant information. When doing so, consider the following questions. What is the typical food of the country? What is my favorite restaurant in city XY? What type of annual events take place in the city or country? What exciting leisure activities might differ from the learner's native culture? What is a reliable news source? What are some local grocery stores? What are some store chains in general? Where do locals shop? Chains, local farmer markets, individual stores, etc. What is the infrastructure like? Education, official institution, transportation, and so on and so forth. In short, what would I show a visitor of the target language country that is culturally important, interesting, and maybe different from what they know, and also positive about the country? Then look for websites and information about these aspects. So finally, language learning is most successful when receiving input. Such input can be listening or reading. When selecting authentic content for beginners, you should always have the learner in mind. Ask yourself what interest each individual learning group could have. What pre-existing knowledge do they come to class with? And what difficulties can be expected? Do not hesitate to select content that is slightly above level. According to Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, the content's difficulty level should be slightly higher than the current language competence. Comprehensible input does not mean learners have to be able to understand everything, but need to be able to partially understand the content through the context. So to facilitate reading and listening comprehension, unknown vocabulary should be scaffolded before working with the text. In addition, to motivate learners and take away their potential fear of working with authentic content, it is helpful to have them focus on words they recognize rather than the ones they do not know yet. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.